Welcome to part 5, where we will discuss the fourth objection to faith, which is that faith contradicts scientists. I bolded the part of the outline that we will fill out in part 5. Those who make this objection basically say that since scientists are smart people and are good at what they do, then we should believe them when they say something that contradicts faith. Now, when a scientist says something that contradicts faith, the weight of their claim has two sources. The first source has to do with their scientific finding. So maybe they found genetic evidence that we have a common ancestor. That was addressed in part 4. The second source has to do with their reputation as a scientist. In other words, we should believe their findings simply because of their reputation of being good at science. So if a scientist says something that contradicts faith, their reputation precedes them, and we can assume that beyond a reasonable doubt that what they are saying is correct. This objection usually takes the form of a statistic and can sound like 97% of scientists believe that the different species evolved over time, or scientists are generally less religious than the general population, or only 33% of scientists believe that God exists. There is usually no scientific analysis given here. The fact that most scientists contradict faith is, in the objector's mind, enough to make it true. The logic is that if most scientists reject faith, then so should we. In this picture, the shepherd knows more than the sheep, just as a scientist would know more than an everyday person. And we, as everyday people, are to humbly follow the scientist's advice. As is usually the case, this objection to faith looks valid on the surface, but a deeper analysis reveals some serious flaws. The first problem is that it is self-defeating. That is, the secular interpretation of science was once rejected by most scientists, which by the objector's own logic makes their objection not true. In fact, science was seen as the study of God's creation, that by studying science, one can better understand God. This is witnessed to both by history and by the fact that virtually every major field of modern-day science was founded by a religious person, particularly a Christian. So unless you say that Christians are more likely to make a scientific breakthrough than non-Christians, this fact shows that the vast majority of scientists were at one time religious. This includes Michael Faraday, who founded electrochemistry, and Gregor Mendel, who pioneered genetics. It includes Isaac Newton with his laws of gravitation, and James Maxwell, whose equations described electromagnetism. And there is Robert Boyle, who founded Boyle's laws for how gases behave. There are many more that I could add to this list, but didn't for time's sake. The point is that virtually all of modern science was founded by scientists who had faith. And that means, by our objector's logic, that at that time it would have been correct to have faith. And if it was correct then the secular scientists who came later, the ones who were cited in the statistics, are wrong. At this point, one might object, saying, yeah, but wasn't pretty much everyone back then religious? In other words, it shouldn't be a shock to us that most of the founding scientists were religious if that's what most people were back then. Or as a statistician would say, your results are not statistically significant. But in the objector's logic, it doesn't matter how one's culture might have influenced their decisions on faith. All that matters is that most scientists do not practice faith. But if we really want to bring in the effects of culture on academic circles, I could just as easily say, well, the reason most scientists aren't religious today is because most of academic culture is that way. So this argument can be used both ways. Another objection might sound like, well, the scientists back then didn't know as much as the scientists know now, so their opinions don't count. And this is in danger of what C.S. Lewis calls chronological snobbery, which is automatically assuming that someone is not as smart as you because they lived in the past. This logic defeats itself because 1,000 years from now, we will be the primitive people that no one wants to listen to. So chronological snobbery works both ways. Besides being self-defeating, these people literally founded their respective fields on the basis of very little knowledge. They were incredibly smart, geniuses, and most importantly, their critical thinking skills were high, which is important when it comes to matters of faith and philosophy. So if anything, their opinions should be weighted more heavily than those of today's scientists. But one might also say, well, didn't those scientists believe in God just because they wanted to believe in Him? This objection does not address my argument. Again, the logic of the objector, which I am using, has nothing to do with why the scientists believe what they do. So whether these scientists believed in God because they wanted to, or because they were being truly objective, does not matter. The logic of the objector is that they believed in God, and they are scientists, so we should too. And even if the motivations did matter, this argument works both ways. I could just as easily turn it around by saying that the scientists who don't practice faith have motivations of their own. The bias exists on both sides. Objection 4 is self-defeating. It also commits two fallacies. Fallacy number 1 is saying that because a scientist is an expert at science, that makes them an expert at faith. No one would go to a plumber to have their car fixed, no matter how good they are at plumbing. The two areas are unrelated. Likewise, no one should go to a scientist to inform them about matters of faith because they're a scientist, no matter how good they are at science. While it is possible for a scientist to be intelligent in matters of faith, this is not necessarily true. In fact, in some cases, quite the opposite is true. This is not to say that we should discredit their opinion because they're scientists. Just know that when it comes to faith, scientists are on the same level as everyone else. But even when scientists are talking about science, that does not necessarily mean that they are correct. So fallacy number 2 is saying that because scientists are experts in science, that they are correct in matters of science. Of course, they are more likely than we are to be correct, but automatically assuming that they are correct because of their expertise is fallacious. We see the potential for error here when we look at history and see the numerous times when the majority of scientists were wrong. In fact, the mainstream scientific community has opposed many of the major scientific discoveries that we now know to be true. This includes Gregor Mendel, who was a monk and founded genetics, and Nicholas Copernicus, who proposed heliocentrism, which is the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. And the fact that those who opposed Copernicus were religious is irrelevant. It does not affect my point, which is that those who are considered the scientific elite can be wrong. Then there was Alfred Wegener, who proposed the theory of continental drift, and Amadeo Avogadro, who invented Avogadro's number used in chemistry. So not only is it fallacious to accept something simply because a scientist says so, there is real danger in this, as demonstrated by history. Scientists can and have been wrong before, and this risk is elevated when the subject being studied has religious implications, or when other evidence seems to contradict it. So you don't get the wrong impression. Just because the majority of scientists accept something does not make it wrong. Rejecting a scientist's opinion because they are a scientist is even more foolish as accepting it, since they are experts in their fields. What I am saying is to not blindly trust them, especially in matters of faith. It is important to make a distinction here. When I said the objector's logic was self-defeating, I was using their own logic against them. In this part, I used my logic to show the fallacies. So I am not contradicting myself. I am not saying we can trust scientists when they say to have faith and then contradicting that, because I am using two different sources of logic. The third and last problem with our objection is that it tends to cite statistics that are biased, for which there are up to 4 sources. Source number 1 is that the studies often include only the types of intellectuals who are less likely to practice faith. Specifically, this means selecting the intellectuals from the departments of biology, psychology, anthropology, philosophy, and physics, which have reputations for being highly secular. But the studies often exclude other types of intellectuals that are more likely to practice faith. This is important because the debate between faith and science encompasses virtually all intellectual disciplines, not just the ones that are selected. So, what about the opinions of mathematicians, or computer scientists, or chemists, or engineers, or theologians, or geneticists, or doctors, or writers? Their opinions should count too. Compounding this source of bias is the fact that these intellectuals tend to be more vocal, and they tend to receive more attention. And again, this is a general rule of thumb and not a blanket statement. But generally, some of the most outspoken individuals on these topics belong to the secular side of things, and these individuals receive disproportionately high amounts of attention from the media. These statistics are like the magnifying glass in the picture. They exclude the majority of what can be looked at and magnify what remains out of proportion. You might be wondering, why is it that certain fields are more likely to contain individuals who do not practice faith? Well, the reason has a lot to do with macroevolution, which attempts to explain the diversity of life randomly. This, by definition, rules out the involvement of a theistic God in the creation of life. So, the fields where evolution is more prominent tends to be more secular. You may have heard evolution described as a theory. Well, in science, theory has a much more rigorous meaning than it does in lay language. In science, a theory is usually supported by a large body of evidence and explains why something works the way it does. So in the case of evolution, it is thought to explain the diversity of life. And because it is called a theory, it is elevated to the same level as, for example, germ theory, which proposes that diseases are caused by pathogens. So in the fields where evolution dominates, such as biology, to disagree with evolution is just as serious as saying that germs don't cause diseases. And the person doing the disagreeing, which is often a person of faith, risks their reputation and career. And this leads to our second source of bias. It is biased to conduct a study in a field such as biology, where those with religious explanations are sometimes silenced. It gives a false impression that all scientists don't have faith, when in reality the scientists with faith are either silenced or they don't even bother entering the field because of their faith. They would be risking their career and reputation to do otherwise. The theistic equivalent of this would be to conduct a study on whether intellectuals think that God exists, and to do it, I go to a seminary and ask a bunch of theologians. Of course they will believe in God, because such a belief is required to get into the seminary. And with evolution, that is very nearly the case in some of the aforementioned fields. This selection of a narrow set of beliefs creates a vicious cycle, where the field becomes increasingly extreme because it only contains those who think a certain way. In psychology, this phenomenon is called groupthink. This is our third source of bias. This graph very roughly illustrates groupthink. As time passes, the views within said fields become exponentially more extreme. So it becomes even harder to survive as a person of faith within these fields, which makes these statistical studies even more skewed. Okay, so let's say you're a biologist who manages to survive within the field while also believing in creationism, which directly contradicts macroevolution. Then one day a survey comes your way asking you if you are a religious person. And let's say that you get over the fear that the survey is not really anonymous and you put your answer. Well, you have just joined the 3% of scientists who practice faith. This leads to our fourth and last source of bias, which is that the scientists who are not silenced, the 3%, are glossed over and are not mentioned. There are millions of scientists out there, and 3% is still a lot of smart people who choose to have faith. And remember from the previous slide that throughout history, there have been proportions of scientists far less than 3% who turned out to be right. A side note is that this percentage increases as one enters the hard sciences like chemistry, biochemistry, engineering, and math, These disciplines stress the use of logic, so the people in these fields tend to be very skilled critical thinkers. Since critical thinking is so important when it comes to matters of faith, I think that this is significant. Again, one might make the objection saying, well, obviously the 3% that have faith are biased. They want their religion to be true, and that's the only reason they believe in the supernatural. It has nothing to do with evidence. And I addressed this earlier. While it is true that these scientists are biased, it is also true that every scientist has bias. For example, maybe the scientists who have faith are afraid of death, so they are more inclined to believe in an afterlife. Conversely, maybe the idea of being accountable to a holy God makes the scientists who don't have faith uncomfortable, which drives their belief. Both sides are biased. I can think of very few hypotheses where the scientist making them does not want their hypothesis to be true, or at least for it to produce some meaningful conclusion. But that does not mean that we can't be objective. There are plenty of excellent scientists on both sides. So these are some potential sources of bias within the studies that are often cited. Again, not every study commits all of them or even any of them. It is a general rule of thumb. So in summary, we determined that our fourth objection, which is that faith contradicts scientists, has three problems. Firstly, it is self-defeating because one only needs to go back in time to a place where most scientists were religious, including many of modern science's founders. Secondly, it is fallacious in two ways. Firstly, scientists are not experts in faith, and secondly, even when they're talking about science, they aren't always correct, as history demonstrates. Thirdly, the statistics that the objectors often cite are biased in up to 4 ways. That is the end of Part 5. In Part 6, we will address our final interpretation of the objection, which is that miracles contradict science. See you there.